From the race for the White House to Congress and Connecticut State Capitol, it's Election Night 2024.
It is a choice about whether we have a country rooted in freedom for every American or ruled by chaos and division.
I will bring back the American dream. Going to bring it back very quickly.
We're walking you through the presidential candidates' potential impacts on life in Connecticut, continuing team coverage at the polls and parties,
plus exclusive on-air interviews with Connecticut leaders and experts.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Connecticut's news station as we kick off another hour of our continuing election coverage. I'm Fox 61's political reporter Emma Woolforce, and I'll be taking you through what is most important to you tonight as we cover the races all the way down your ballot. Polls now are closing across the state, and as results are starting to come into us, we'll bring them. Of course, important to remember tonight, more than a third of the state's registered voters already cast their ballots before today, Election Day. More than 740,000 people taking advantage of in-person early voting. And that's not even counting absentee ballots. So as our local poll workers get busy counting ballots from all forms of voting right now, we're talking about the battle for congressional power and Connecticut's role in it. The U.S. Senate is up for grabs tonight, and Connecticut has one seat up for re-election. Democrat Chris Murphy's Fox 61's Kay Pattyfoot is at Duncan Park in Hartford, where supporters are gathering tonight.
The polls just closed, and we are waiting for the results in the Senate race in Connecticut. Now, Senator Chris Murphy has been campaigning on what he's accomplished in his term so far. To name a few, the bipartisan Safer Community Act, National Paid Family Leave, and he says if reelected, he will take on price gouges.
I'm trying to bring people together in Washington at a time where, that city is very divided, but I don't take anything for granted.
You can see here the crowd is starting to form at his watch party as we wait for the count here in Hartford. We will keep you updated on the Senate race and the results. In Hartford, Kay Pattyfoot, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
Thank you, Kay. Let's check in now as well with Fox 61's Kayla Cade, who's at a watch party for Senator Murphy's opponent, Matthew Corey, in East Hartford.
Currently here at the One Wood Pub restaurant that is owned by U.S. Senate Republican candidate Matt Corey. There's a lot of people here, and I'm actually going to step out of the camera so you guys can get a better view of everyone that's here. Now, considering that this is a restaurant, there's a lot of people eating and just drinking their beverages and everything. And then there's also a couple of people here that are wearing shirts in support of their Republican candidate that they voted for, Matt Corey. Now, we are going to keep you updated here at Fox 61 with the results for the election in East Hartford. Kayla Cade, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
Thank you, Kayla. Let's touch quickly on the larger stakes here, the congressional balance of power. We're breaking down Connecticut's role in the U.S. House ahead, but let's start with the Senate now, where Democrats functionally have a slight upper hand and power right now as few independent seats caucus with them. But there are 34 seats up across the country tonight. Democrats are overwhelmingly on the defense to keep power in those chambers. The GOP doesn't have to flip more than a couple seats to take control. We've got a lot more ahead. We're staying here on air with you, talking through results and the congressional stakes with this competitive 5th district race. We've got reporters at the polls and at the parties and with the candidates themselves. Plus, we can't forget about the state races. Your representation at the Connecticut State Capitol could seriously shake up this year, and all ahead of a budget session starting in January. We have details on that and spoke one-on-one with State Comptroller Sean Scanlon about the state's economy ahead of this election. Of course, our voting looks different this general election here in Connecticut, and so will our results because of that. As we said at the top of the show, 741,501 people statewide took advantage of in-person early voting this year, but many didn't expect to see that much of a difference or have a different experience. We heard your questions, though. We have some answers as to why you had to sign your ballot envelope, what it has to do with tonight's counting and results, plus how your vote can then be kept private. So let's verify. If you did early vote, you may have noticed you didn't run your ballot through the machine like usual. Instead, you were asked to put your ballot in an envelope, then guided through sealing and signing it. That is, except for the towns which missed those instructions for a few hundred voters. They had to recast their ballots. Nevertheless, it's something many weren't used to, and for some, it brought up questions and concerns about privacy and the secrecy of their vote. We talked with the Secretary of the State, Connecticut's election leader, along with several registrars and poll workers. It is a Class D felony for anyone to do anything that enables them to find out how someone voted, including an election official handling ballots. So no, poll workers are not allowed to sit and read your ballot, but state law says you do need to sign and certify it, whether voting early in person, absentee, or if you register the same day you vote. Why is that? Well, all these ballots aren't being counted until today, Election Day. Your signature ensures you certified your ballot, that you filled it out, since you didn't get to put it right through the tabulator yourself. Instead, a poll worker is essentially casting the ballot for you. Workers are also able to check their voter rolls against your signature to double check your status and that you're not casting more than one vote. That's why signing the envelope is a security measure the state capitol decided wouldn't hurt when they put together our early voting process. Now that we've successfully done it during a general election, state lawmakers will be reviewing how this year went and will discuss possible changes in the upcoming legislative session this January. We also asked the experts, now that polls are closed, how exactly does this count happen? Listen to what they specifically pointed out about Connecticut's process happening as we speak.
In some jurisdictions across the country, people are transporting ballots to a central county location. But here in Connecticut, we're doing all of that counting, recounts, and so on in the local municipality.
Here in Connecticut, all 169 municipalities, it is their responsibility. It's the registrar's offices that have to conduct voting. It is their respective town clerks who are responsible for absentee ballots. We endeavor to make sure that every poll site, whether it's the early voting poll site, the same-day registration sites, both in early voting and election day, and each district in town is staffed by a bipartisan group of poll workers. The poll site will close up. The moderators and assistant registrars that are at each poll site will begin closing shop. They'll go over to secure the tabulator machine that every voter is putting their ballots through. They will end the election on that and start printing the tapes. These tapes have all the results on them. And so they post them up publicly. These tapes are very accurate counts of each ballot that is put through the machine. We test our machines rigorously in the weeks leading up to the election. We have spare machines in case something breaks during the day, but all of that has a paper trail.
And here on Connecticut's news station, we're calling results by the AP, the Associated Press. The Standard, they've compiled election results in every state for more than 170 years. And we call races and declare winners when they do, because the results aren't actually certified for up to a month in some cases. So being able to carefully and accurately call a race once enough votes are tabulated is really important. So unless a candidate concedes tonight, we will only call races not based on network, but based on the AP's official call. You can text the word results right now to the phone number on your screen, 860-527-6161, and we'll send you a link to our comprehensive results page with all the races and all of our coverage. So again, text the word results to the number on your screen to have all of that sent right to your phone. Checking in with us now is Professor Mara Sutman-Lee from Connecticut College. Mara, you live, breathe voting, reform, expansion, turnout. We've been talking about the difference in voting options this election with the first 2 full weeks of early voting in a general election this year, and also a ballot question about whether or not to expand absentee ballot voting. So Connecticut is a state that holds all of these early voting ballots and absentee ballots until Election Day. There has been some concern about poll workers having to count all of these at once tonight. What does this all mean for how long it could take us to see some results?
expect to see some delays that are a little bit unusual relative to previous election years, but that doesn't mean that there's anything that is wrong or nefarious that's going on. It's simply a part of the process of adopting a new election reform and responding to those changes, training poll workers, and making sure that votes are counted fairly and accurately does take time. At the same time, one thing that I will note about early voting in particular is that it doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be a great deal more ballots that are being counted in terms of turnout. Early voting tends to displace voters who would already have voted on election day. Now, we still might see high turnout in Connecticut for other reasons, but it isn't necessarily that poll workers and election workers are going to be processing an inordinate number of more ballots on election night. But at the same time, I think it would be reasonable to expect some delays just because this is a new procedure and adapting and adopting new procedure takes some time.
Gotcha. We know everyone's obviously thinking about this because we're coming off of 2020 when anyone could vote via absentee. Voters had to apply again, get approved for an excuse this year. But on their ballots also is the choice to open up absentee ballot voting. Once again, no excuse here in Connecticut specifically. That would change our state constitution to allow that. The question has become how secure is absentee voting, whether no excuse or via application. Statistics and state leaders tell us it really just increases the amount of legal registered voters who take part in each election. But of course, on Connecticut voters' minds is this ongoing scandal surrounding Bridgeport absentee ballots last year, the alleged stuffing of ballot boxes and fraud. We spoke with State Representative Matt Blumenthal, who's led the effort for people to vote yes on no excuse absentee ballot voting. He told us even the judges on this case say take the politics out of passing and pressuring absentee ballots. Let anyone have one. Take a listen to what he had to say here.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the Bridgeport situation was a black eye for our state and its elections. But the important things to know are, first of all, that fraud and misconduct are very, very rare, and especially the amount of misconduct that may affect an election. And the other thing that they should be aware of is that we've taken strong measures to correct the Bridgeport situation, especially in terms of mandating video surveillance of all drop boxes that's available to the public, speeding up investigations and prosecutions, making sure they're done vigorously, and increasing tracking and other elements of security. This was a bipartisan bill we passed this past session. Another thing they should be aware of is that absentee voting for all will help take care of that security situation. Both of the judges that administered the cases involving those mayoral elections recommended that we adopt a system of absentee voting for all. That's because our complex, narrow system creates lots of opportunities, first of all, for people to be confused or deterred from voting absentee, but also opportunities for unethical operatives to perhaps deceive people into voting when they shouldn't. We want to take away that advantage, make absentee voting accessible to everyone.
So, Professor, we want to bring you back in here now. Just how secure are Connecticut's absentee ballots, especially with these cases of misconduct kind of looming over the possible expansion of them?
Yeah, I think that based on my own research and years of observing no excuse absentee mail voting in other states in my research over the years, I think that his points are really well taken. The issue with excuse-based absentee voting, one of the biggest issues is actually a logistical challenge for registrars and for election officials in sort of overseeing this excuse-based system. There's not a lot of oversight that is possible. Is John Smith going to be out of town on election day? I'm not necessarily going to be able to go to his house to confirm whether or not that is the case. And so I think that the judges are correct in their interpretation that this will actually remove a lot of that incentive. I think the other thing that's going to be really important for the General Assembly to consider, should they have the opportunity to take this up, is the penalties for election fraud that's committed using no excuse absentee voting, or the penalties for election fraud in general. In some states, it's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Large fines are being levied. And in many cases, this is a risk that is just simply not worth taking on a large scale that's going to be large enough to tip the election one way or the other.
Gotcha. Well, Professor, thank you so much for providing a little bit of insight there. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming out of that now, we do have an important race call we want to bring you. The AP has called the state of Connecticut officially for current Vice President and Democratic nominee for the White House, Kamala Harris. And as we've been discussing tonight, the congressional balance of power very much up for grabs right now. Congress is the president's purse strings and basically decides what that administration can and can't accomplish. So these races really are some of the most important to watch. Let's talk specifically about Connecticut. All 5 U.S. House seats are up for re-election here, and the entire U.S. House across the country could change tonight. The House specifically must approve legislation into laws and is in charge of creating federal budget proposals. The majority of Connecticut's lawmakers in those chambers have been there for several terms, some of them since the 1990s, some since the early 2000s. The most freshman, though, Jahana Hayes, who's held the seat only since 2019. All 5 are Democrats, but while many may call Connecticut a true blue state, the truth is that landscape is changing. We're talking especially about the 5th district here, where Congresswoman Hayes has been in this seat the least amount of time, as we said, compared to some of the long-standing representatives. The western part of Connecticut's representation on Capitol Hill in the 5th district, truly one of the most spanning House seats we have. You can see there on your screen just how far this reaches. This district is one of the least Democratic, according to Cook's voting index, and we've seen that manifest with some really tight races. Let's take a look at this race here. Last congressional election cycle in 2022. It was so competitive, we didn't know the official winner, who was called until 2 days after the election when George Logan conceded. And the projections prior to tonight are calling for another close race, this time maybe even tighter. The truth is George Logan could have a really decent chance at flipping this seat. And that's not only historic for Connecticut, as we haven't had a Republican U.S. representative since Chris Shays, who lost to Jim Himes in 2008, but a Logan win could also mean one more seat Republicans are able to flip in the U.S. House as they campaign to keep their slim majority there. We're just starting to get some results here, as you can see. Not really anything happening or populating yet. Polls just closed 17 minutes ago, so it's taking some time, but we're going to keep you updated with the latest numbers as we start to get them here and online and on the Fox 61 News app. Of course, we've been at the poll stations today speaking with candidates and election day voters, and we've had our reporters out in the districts tonight, and they're watching the results come in as well. Let's start now with Fox 61 Matt Caron, who's been with incumbent Jahana Hayes' watch party tonight down in Waterbury. Matt, I know you were able to get into the venue there, so what have you been seeing? It looks like you're back outside now.
Yeah, Emma, so we actually left the Courtyard Marriott, which is where Jahana Hayes is having her watch party, because quite frankly, there just wasn't a whole lot going on there. People were just starting to come into the room. They blew up the balloons, but we said, let's get out to where the people are and see if we can talk to some voters and actually see if we could talk to Jahana Hayes herself, because one of the members of the campaign said that if you go in front of Crosby High School, there's a chance she might show up before the polls close at 8 o'clock. Well, here we are in front of Crosby High School. We have not seen Jahana Hayes, and of course the polls are closed now. But good news is we did speak with one of her supporters, and she told us exactly why she supports the incumbent Democratic Congresswoman. Very personal reasons. Here's what she had to say.
I didn't like smear campaigns, but I definitely know who's probably going to win it, and she's great. You know, I love her. You know, she's for the people. She knows what it's like to be a single mom, and you know, no future, and she pulled herself out of that, and look at her. She's great. She's very into education, which I'm really, really passionate about. I'm a foster mom of an autistic child, and her education values I really, really admire.
Jahana Hayes is 51 years old. She got elected in 2019, made history as the first black Democrat and black woman to represent Connecticut in Congress. The 5th District, as Emma mentioned, the state's most purple one. Democratic control since 2006 and encompasses much of western Connecticut, a few municipalities, big ones like Waterbury and Danbury. But back in 2022, this race, of course, now a rematch, but back then, just 2,000 votes separated these two candidates. A really close one. Hayes, of course, from Waterbury, former National Teacher of the Year, and considers herself a progressive. So as these votes continue to come in, we're going to watch them, we're going to count them, and as soon as we know something, we'll bring it, of course, straight to you. But for now, we're live here in Waterbury. Matt Caron, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
Thank you so much, Matt. We'll be checking in with you back in a little bit, but let's turn things over now to Fox 61's Bridget Burelow. She's live in New Britain. It's part of District 5, and people are still in line now to vote, even though polls have closed. What's going on there, Bridget?
Hi, Emma. Yeah, we are coming to you live from Chamberlain Elementary School in New Britain. This is part of Congressional District 5. We're here in Connecticut. Polls closed 20 minutes ago, but check out the people still waiting in line behind me here. And the lines don't even go just behind me, but also this way as well. So there's probably a couple dozen people still in line, and they're being told the same message: stay in line. And as long as you stay there, you'll be guaranteed the right to vote. There has been so much enthusiasm for this election, not just for the presidential race, but also our local races, especially that District 5 seat, which, as you remember, back in 2022, it was very, very close, a nail biter till the very finish against Jahana Hayes. And we were talking about George Logan as well. George Logan lost it about 2,000 votes behind, and he thinks this is the year that he can make up that momentum and he can finally win the seat, which would be historic for Connecticut. It'd be the first time in 18 years that the state sends a Republican to Washington. So we'll see if that happens. He promises to bring big changes to Washington while also maintaining his independence. He says his allegiance is with Connecticut, not with his party, and he hopes that he's elected for the job. We spoke with him earlier today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I don't want to go to Washington to represent any political party or special interest group other than the folks in the 5th Congressional District, our families, our parents, our veterans, our seniors. There's so much to be done that we need to tackle that, unfortunately, my opponent just hasn't done. She's had the opportunity to do that. She hasn't, and now it's time for a change.
This race has not been called yet, but if you were to ask me what the pulse is of this race, it's so hard to tell, Emma, because we spoke with 4 different voters at 2 different sites. 2 of the voters told us they were going for Logan. 2 of them said they're going for Hayes. So it really is another 50-50 split, although it seems we'll see if one of them breaks away later on today, hopefully when a result is called. But Logan says he thinks there could be another day or 2, perhaps, once all those votes are counted and tallied, until we know who comes out on top in Congressional District 5. Emma?
Thank you so much, Bridget. As you mentioned, definitely a really tight race there. Thanks for checking in. We'll be tuning back to you in a little bit. We want to announce again, as we told you a little bit ago, in case you missed it, the AP has officially called the state of Connecticut for current vice president and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. We have the results up on the screen for you now. AP has called the race, with Harris leading with 61% of the vote. Former President Donald Trump, Republican nominee, with 37% of the vote. Let's not forget, though, while lots of us are keeping close watch on the 5th District race, every one of Connecticut's seats in the U.S. House of Representatives is up. So let's take a look at the 2nd District now in the eastern part of our state. This encompasses all of New London, Tullum, and Windham counties, along with parts of Hartford, Middlesex, and New Haven. So 6 of our 9 counties here. The 2nd District is not only one of the most expansive districts in the state, but is the least Democratic as far as voter makeup, where you'll find the largest concentrations of Connecticut's Republican voters, along along with independent and unaffiliated voters. But they're currently represented down in D.C. by Democrat Congressman Joe Courtney, who's been in the seat for nearly 20 years. He originally defeated Republican Rob Simmons in the country's closest congressional race of 2006, and he strongly held that seat ever since. We are looking at a familiar matchup tonight. Joe Courtney being challenged by Republican Mike France again. This was the race in 2022. And here's what we're seeing right now with just the earliest results. We're looking at about 53% Mike France, 47% Joe Courtney there. As we said, polls closed just about 24 minutes ago. So these are our earliest results coming into the newsroom. We did speak with both of these candidates about a little bit of everything a few weeks ago, but especially what we heard from the district as their priorities, from AUKUS to shipyard contracts to healthcare and prescription drug costs, plus protections for reproductive healthcare. Take a listen.
Right now, there's actually pretty encouraging bipartisan support for AUKUS. We've obviously got work to do here. EB actually is outpacing really the other shipyards and supply chain companies because their hiring has been so successful. But we need to strengthen that supply chain to get that production cadence up to the level that we need.
When you make a commitment to an ally, you should be able to honor that commitment. And the practical reality on numbers of submarines is we would need to be building 2.3 submarines per year on average in order to meet the demand that is required. We're averaging one per year, and that goes back to 2019. And unfortunately, my opponent doesn't really understand the industry and what the impact is. We
really should take the success of the price negotiation and really make that available to all Americans. That's an issue I'm very excited about going back to Washington and working on.
One of the drivers of cost of drugs in particular are the pharmacy benefits managers. It's a creation of Congress that's been around for 30 plus years. They're like middlemen who are between the pharmaceutical companies and the vendors. Congress has created programs they probably thought would be good for things, but have ultimately resulted in increased costs.
As someone who was in the legislature when we passed codification of Roe v. Wade, which was a very bipartisan vote at the time, I want to do that in Washington with the Women's Healthcare Protection Act. Having this patchwork of laws and rules is just not good health care.
It should have been a state issue all the way along. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided differently 50 years ago, but now we are back to the states. I believe that parents should always be involved in the decisions that are impacting their children. And that is why I sponsored that. But I do not believe the federal government should be mandating all 50 states do that.
In the first district up in north central Connecticut, anchored by the state capital, Hartford, but with some other cities, Torrington and Bristol, too. Residents here have been represented by Democratic Congressman John Larson since 1999. As a member of the Revenue and Social Security Committees, he's perhaps best known right now as the leader of the plan President Biden has endorsed to save Social Security from completely drying up. Republican Army veteran Jim Griffin is running against the incumbent Larson. Interestingly enough, he was a Kennedy-Reagan Democrat until 2016 when he decided to switch his affiliation and voted for former president and current nominee Donald Trump. He's caught slack for promoting several conspiracy theories as his policies, including that the COVID-19 pandemic was faked. Mary Saunders is running under the Green Party, opposing aid to Israel and supporting free Medicare and child care. Connecticut's 3rd congressional district stretches from the Long Island Sound to New Haven to the Naugatuck Valley and Waterbury. It's represented by one of the highest-ranking Democrats, Rosa DeLauro, on the Appropriations Committee, which directly decides federal funding. She's been the 3rd district's congresswoman since 1991. The race tonight is between her and Republican challenger Michael Massey. Some may have heard his story of how he first found out about former President Trump and the Republican Party while in jail. That's what inspired him to now run as a Republican, his platform mostly focused on the inner city and recidivism. And the 4th congressional district here in the southwestern part of the state, the district is largely suburban. It does include a lot of Connecticut's largest one of Connecticut's largest cities, to Bridgeport, and it extends to Greenwich, Danbury, and the lower Naugatuck Valley. Historically, it was a classic Yankee Republican district, but it's now become one of the most Democratic in Connecticut, according to the Cook Index rating. This district was Joe Biden's best showing in the entire state back in 2020. Currently represented by Democrat Jim Himes. He's a member of the Financial Services Committee, but is also ranking on the Intelligence Committee. He's attempting to ward off two challengers for the District 4 seat that he's held since 2009. Republican Dr. Michael Goldstein, who's focused on crime rates and cuts across federal budgets to bring down spending, and Benjamin Wesley, a mechanical engineer and independent candidate. He decided to throw his name in the race because he's deeply concerned about the expanding conflict in Gaza and the region, especially nuclear warfare. Here with me now, Professor Marianne Borelli from Connecticut College to talk about the big presidential race tonight and also a focus on Congress. Professor, we just went through all 5 of the districts here, and I'm sure you heard a little bit ago the AP officially called Connecticut for Vice President Harris, but obviously it's going to take a while for other states to get called for most results to come in the race for the White House. But we know that a lot of people are watching those results, and we've heard from voters that when they look at Vice President Harris, who was attached obviously to the Biden administration, a lot of times they think all the things she's promising, well, why didn't those get done while she's been in office? We just broke down all the congressional districts. Tell us a little bit about why that can really impact a White House administration and what they're able to get done.
I think there's 2 things to remember, because there's a tendency to talk about the Harris administration. This is the Biden administration, and she was vice president. And as vice president, like any other member of the administration, she had certain areas in which she had considerable discretion and other areas in which it was important that she align and support the president. So in a Harris administration, she will be setting the agenda. It will be her priorities. I think the other thing that's important to remember is that as a vice president, she had considerable responsibilities with regard to the Senate. She was a former senator. So she's going to bring that legislative awareness and her policy awareness as a vice president into her own administration and create a new rhythm.
And so I do want to mention here, we're hearing that the AP has officially called the Senate race for Chris Murphy. That was sort of expected, leaning more toward him, but obviously, you know, this was impacting Congress's balance of power. We were talking about the House and the 5th district, but Murphy's Senate seat, the Democrats have a very slim majority in the Senate right now. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that balance of power can impact, you know, how the White House interacts with Congress as well?
It makes a huge difference. If you have a unified government, then you're able to put forward a policy and proposals, and you're negotiating with your own party to really secure the majority in the House and then the necessary supermajority in the Senate. But if you have a divided government, then you're immediately having to negotiate with a different party, and in these polarized times, the negotiations are very fraught. So how big, not just who has the majority and who has the minority, but how big the majorities are, it makes a difference.
And as you said, how big those margins are, but also, of course, what's going on in each chamber, because we've seen a lot of issues with this past Congress. We've heard from our representatives when I've spoken with them, so much of that deadlock in the House, and we're potentially seeing possibly, you know, the Republican House could flip to Democrat, while the Democrat Senate could flip to Republican, and they could be right back with, you know, these sort of crisscrossed wires. You know, are there any concerns for whoever ends up winning the White House going into the upcoming term next year, if, you know, Congress stays this way with both chambers under different party control?
It makes things much harder.
Okay.
Quite simply, and that's probably very obvious, but the thing is about it is that in the Senate you have the potential for a filibuster, and so you're always thinking about that 60 votes that you have to get, right? In the House, most things are done by a straightforward majority, 51%. So it depends on which House is going in which direction. The other thing that's really important is that they have different roles and responsibilities. So for the Senate, getting your judges confirmed can be very difficult if it's the opposing party, right? This has been right now the Democrats are working very hard to get all of Biden's judicial appointments through. And this is one of the things that Trump was particularly skilled at putting through with McConnell, a record number of judges put through in terms of their confirmations and subsequent appointments.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. We will be checking back in with you later throughout the night, but thank you so much for talking with us a little bit now. As I mentioned, that call of the Senate seat for Chris Murphy. We're taking a live look out at his party right now at Duncan Park. Obviously, a big call here for balance of power in the Senate, as we were saying, but not exactly unlikely. It was trending toward looking at him retaining his seat, and you're seeing some numbers now. Chris Murphy with 71% of that vote. His Republican challenger, Matthew Corey, with 27% of the vote there. And you can go ahead and text the word results. We're going to have a phone number up on your screen in a second. That's 860-527-6161, where we'll be bringing you a comprehensive results page with all of our races, all of our coverage. If you text the word results to the phone number on your screen, and we'll send you our results as we're following them. And perhaps now the question that we get most when it comes to pocketbook policies, the economy, is when you might feel a difference. That's because the numbers say the economy is better, but everyday prices make it hard to believe. Some leaders on the campaign trail from our own state to D.C. are pointing fingers at price gouging studies, saying even as inflation cools, corporations are keeping prices higher and higher simply because they can. Vice President Harris, a former Attorney General herself, has proposed a national ban on price gouging. We sat down one-on-one with our own Attorney General, William Tong, who's already gotten started on that work right here in Connecticut.
Yeah, what I know after 6 years of being Attorney General is that we're constantly being squeezed. You know, me and my wife, we have an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 13-year-old, right? We're in the eye of the hurricane. And it feels like every day someone's trying to rip us off and take advantage of us, right? Whether it's the high cost of utilities and electricity and natural gas. We've seen some of our local utilities go to PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, and look for exorbitant hundreds of millions of dollars increases on utilities when nobody in the state can afford another dollar. I'm investigating grocery and food prices, not because I, have a special desire to target retailers or grocery stores, but because we're getting squeezed, we're getting crushed. And we hear about things like shrinkflation, right? Why does it feel like a bag of chips? Looks like the same size bag of chips, but there are less chips in there, right? Or someone said something about seltzer recently that, well, it was always a 12-pack, but now it's an 8-pack, and it seems to cost the same as it always did. So we're looking deep into the causes of that and why it's happening. And let me just say, what we're learning also is it's really hard for retailers. Yeah. It's really hard for our local grocery stores. The big chains are able to weather the storm better, I think, but your local retailers, independents, the mom and pops, they're getting crushed too.
Right.
And they're having a hard time keeping the lights on, the doors open, and they're getting squeezed in the same way that we're getting squeezed by utility costs and wholesale costs and the cost of putting goods on the shelves. So all of us are facing really increased costs, and I don't know there's any one force to blame, right. but my job is to go in there and to push back on that squeeze and to give people some room to breathe. So that's why I have a dedicated unit taking on the utilities every single day. That's why I'm investigating prices, and if we find price gouging in grocery stores and in supermarkets, we're going to take action. I won't hesitate. That's why I'm leading the national generic drug price fixing cases, right? I announced just this week a big breakthrough settlement with 2 pharmaceutical companies who were artificially inflating the price of prescription drugs and medicine and taking advantage and ripping off people. What I think we have to do is strengthen our price gouging laws here in Connecticut. I only have the ability right now to go after retailers for price gouging. I actually don't have the ability to go up the chain to wholesalers, distributors, manufacturers, which is crazy, right? Sometimes the gouging happens here or up here, and you've got to have the tools as the state of Connecticut and the Attorney General to be able to go after those bad actors.
And that power to go after corporations higher in the supply chain, if found to be increasing prices on Connecticut businesses and consumers, is supposed to be discussed in the upcoming legislative session, which starts this January. We also spoke exclusively this week with State Comptroller Sean Scanlon ahead of the upcoming session, which will decide the next state budget, just how important that makes not only federal, but state races tonight.
We've been talking so much in the past couple weeks, and I think months at this point, about this very important, very unique presidential race. But of course, there are so many other important congressional races and down ballot, whether it's state legislative all the way to even some municipal posts that are on the ballots as well. Our legislatures makeup, both state and federal, could really change with this election. And you have a perspective on just, how big this could be right now, because next state legislative session 2025 is a budget year and you handle the state finances. So just tell me right now, how it's been feeling during this election season.
Well, listen, the national race gets all the attention,
right?
But there are probably 10 or 15 elections here in Connecticut for state senate and state representative that will come down to less than 100 votes, if not sometimes a handful of votes. And so I tell people all the time, yes, the oxygen is with the federal race, but pay attention to your local state rep race, because every race from president to probate judge has an impact on your community and has an impact on the issues that you care about. Engage in those races, find out who your candidates are, and don't just vote for president and walk out. Go all the way down the ballot and vote for the candidates that you think are best suited to represent you.
And we know now this year, this is the first general election with early voting. So a lot of people I talked to in the past few weeks since it started have already voted, which is really exciting. Before I get into some more of those impacts, how are the, Connecticut's finances right now? What is the state of the state's finances looking like? Because we know we've been on the up and up the past couple times we've chatted about this.
10 years ago, Connecticut was in a permanent fiscal crisis, and thanks to reforms that we put in place on a bipartisan basis in 2017, Connecticut is now in a position where our fiscal health has never been healthier. We've got 6 consecutive years of ending our budget with a surplus. We have paid down $8.5 billion of pension debt, and we have a rainy day fund that is full for the first time in the history of Connecticut. When you compare our fiscal success with what's happening economically, lowest unemployment rate since 2001, inflation cooling, wage growth up, we're sort of primed to have continued fiscal and budget success going forward. And I think the big challenge of this General Assembly that will be elected in this year's election will be, how can we find the balance between continuing our fiscal progress and meeting the needs of today? And I look forward as the comptroller to working with them and the governor to find that balance.
And we know that has been a difficult balance to strike. It's been part of the conversation, at the very least for the last 2 legislative sessions, of a lot of people saying, well, the state has all this money left over. Why aren't we seeing a little bit more relief? But obviously we saw this past session, the fiscal guardrails were just re-upped, as you said, on a bipartisan basis. We did hear, though, some talk from lawmakers, and as you said, new people who will be voted in, about whether or not this next session should look at, maybe rethinking or reworking those fiscal guardrails. What's your position on that?
I think everyone from the most progressive Democrat to the most conservative Republican is not saying we should get rid of the guardrails. I think all of them agree that that we have fundamentally taken Connecticut in a much better place.
Right.
It's almost as if we have a good problem to have, which is, are we saving too much money, right? That is not where we were 10 years ago. And so what I tell people all the time is, I think we have found a good balance so far, and we ended the fiscal crisis that we were in, which is the main part of what those guardrails were all about. Now what we need to do is figure out what the next iteration of Connecticut wants to be.
Right.
And I do think we can continue finding that balance between the needs of yesterday and the needs of today. What I'll also say to you is that we are lucky that the federal monetary policy in this country has attained what's called the soft landing. That basically means that we cooled inflation without messing up our jobs market. And that was what Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve have been trying to do for 2 years.
Right.
It's very painful. Our interest rates remain high for way too long. Inflation was a reality for our lives for a long time. Now, inflation has finally cooled to where it is supposed to be from an economics perspective, and we're seeing wage growth is outpacing inflation. So that means more people have money in their pocket, and the things that they go and buy at the grocery store are not as expensive. That's a good thing for people. And if we can continue along those lines, it's a good thing for our state.
And we're interrupting that package really quick to bring you a live update of Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. He was just called as the winner in his re-election bid. Let's listen in.
Gun safety measure passed in the United States Congress in 30 years, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. I just think on a night like tonight, it's important to remember that we don't work as Democrats and as progressives to win elections. Elections are a means to an end. We work so hard on these elections because we want to change people's lives, right? We don't accept a world in which big corporations capture all of the power and resources, leaving peanuts for the rest of us, right? We don't accept a world in which our children fear for their lives when they walk to school and when they sit in school. We run these elections to win, but then to do something with the power that we are given by the voters. And I'm very proud of the accomplishment that we have been able to achieve together as a pair, as a partnership in the Senate. But I tell you, I'm prouder of nothing more than after 30 years of the gun lobby being in charge of Washington, D.C., watching Connecticut lead the growth of the modern anti-gun violence movement, and 2 years ago, passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So I love this job. I work hard to do it right. I want to continue to do that work of reaching out across the aisle to try to make change. Now, I know we are going to have a long night tonight. I don't think we'll necessarily know this evening what the outcome is, whether we continue to control the United States Senate, whether we're able to make Hakeem Jeffries the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. But I have a feeling in my heart that we have left it all on the table. I know that there is no effort that wasn't spared, and I am hopeful and confident, whether it be tonight, tomorrow morning, or Wednesday afternoon.
And we're back now. You were just hearing a little bit of Senator Chris Murphy's live victory speech there at Duncan Park here in Hartford as his race was just called in his favor, his re-election bid to the Senate. He was talking a little bit in his victory speech there about some of the other races in Congress as well as the presidential race. Joining me now, we have our partisan panel, former Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, Democrat, and chair of the state Republican Party, Ben Proto. Ben, Luke, thank you so much for being here. Thanks. Spoken with both of you a lot of times before. Happy to have both of you on the desk tonight. I want to start off really quickly with reaction. We just saw Senator Murphy's victory speech there, a race that wasn't exactly too exciting. It was leaning more in his favor. But what's your reaction to hearing that tonight?
I think not much of a surprise. Right. Matt got in the race late, ran a great race. He's tremendously personable. People really were attracted to Matt and wanted to talk with Matt. It's very difficult to take a two-term United States Senator with $14 million and run a race on low dollars. But he did it. He was all over the state. He was talking to people. He was at every fair, every street fair, knocking doors, something that a lot of statewide candidates don't often do, literally knocking on people's doors and asking for their votes. So I think Matt, can hold his head really high tonight. He did a great job. Very proud of what he did and how he carried the Republican banner. And Matt's not someone who's going to go away.
Yeah. And Luke?
Look, as Ben said, no surprise in this result, but really strong margin. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that Chris Murphy has established himself as one of the most effective United States senators in the country. I mean, you heard it in his remarks, but he was the principal author of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the most significant piece of gun safety legislation this country's passed in a generation. And he was the lead negotiator on the immigration bill that would have gotten bipartisan support had former President Trump not asked the Republicans in Congress to kill that bill. I think he has shown himself to be somebody who can be extremely effective, not just as a voice for his constituents and for our state, but as a senator in the chamber getting things done. We should be really proud of that as Connecticut residents.
You mentioned some of those big policies. Ben, I want to start with you here, and I want to talk a little bit more about parties. We saw the other race call tonight so far has been Connecticut for current Vice President and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. We know it's sometimes an uphill battle for candidates in Connecticut for Republican candidates in a majority of races because a lot of these seats have been long held by Democrats. The state GOP is constantly lodging challenges to the state's incumbents, though. What policies would you say, if we're looking at congressional races here, are different and would warrant change in those seats for 2024?
Well, I think we're going to talk about campaigns that are now closed, but clearly the biggest question that the Democrats have never been able to answer is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Vice President had been asked that question a number of times and really is not able to answer it. And I talked to a reporter the other day, and I had someone say to me the other day when we were talking about this very thing, he says, under Donald Trump, I had money left at the end of the month. And under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I have month left at the end of the money. And so I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at these things, we're looking at the fiscal issues, we're looking at the cost of goods, the cost of services, the cost of electricity, the cost of insurance, the cost of childcare, the cost of health care. Those are the issues that I think are driving voters, not only here in Connecticut, but across the country. And I think those are the issues that are going to drive the outcomes of elections, across, not only here, but across the country.
We know economy always a big issue for voters. And as I've spoken with people about the state races, obviously they know the cost of living tends to be high in Connecticut. And those, kitchen table economic issues are still really important. Luke, for you, how can especially these Democratic leaders who have held these seats for a long time, how can they talk about making a day-to-day difference for people like your former constituents, here in Hartford? You passed the mayoral torch last year when Ben is saying about people wondering, if they were better off. Yeah. What are some of the things there for you?
Well, look, first of all, I think there's some things that Ben said that I agree with, and there's some things that I don't agree with. Not surprising. What I agree with is that the issues of kitchen table economic pressures, that's on the minds of everybody. Sure. I think the idea that Americans were better off 4 years ago at the end of Donald Trump's mishandling of the COVID pandemic is a little silly. And it's important to remember that what the Biden-Harris administration inherited was one of the riskiest times in American history. And what they had to prevent was another Great Depression. They did that. And then we had to contend with inflation, which is now coming down, but there's lots more work to do. Here in Connecticut, what I think we need to focus on are those things we can control at the state level, or at least influence at the state level. And that includes things like the availability of housing opportunity. Across the income spectrum in communities of all kinds, housing costs and housing availability is a real pressure point. Another issue is the affordability of childcare. And I think that coming into this legislative session, I expect that those may be a couple of important issues, sure. As well as continuing the progress that the state has made in securing ensuring fiscal stability while at the same time making sure that we're making those investments in communities and in families that make it easier to get by and get ahead.
And before I go to Ben, Luke, I want to follow up with that because I've asked a couple of our representatives this as well. What do you say to constituents and residents who are saying, hey, I saw inflation is cooling, maybe the economy is looking better overall, or as I talked with the comptroller, the state of Connecticut's finances are much better than they were 10 years ago, but people are not feeling those immediate effects. They still see really, really high prices. What do you say to people who are kind of looking at that juxtaposition right now?
Well, again, first of all, I think we have to be honest about what you can control at the state level and what you can't, right? I mean, the state can't really control the price of groceries, right? And you have seen inflation coming down, but as Kamala Harris has said throughout this campaign, lots more work to do. At the state level, I do think some of those issues I just mentioned are areas of focus. Okay. Affordability of childcare, availability of housing and cost of housing. We make sure that our state college and university system is both affordable and offering students the paths to opportunity that they need. And I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the state continues to grow economically. So we have been on a really strong path as a state, but that doesn't mean we don't have a lot more work to do. It doesn't mean that families aren't feeling that pressure here in Connecticut just as they are across the country. But I think the lesson we need to take away is we're doing things that are moving the needle, but the job is not done yet.
Yeah.
I hope what Americans decide today is that the answer to that is to continue the work, not to go back to what I see as the chaos of what came before it.
And Ben, I do want to talk a little bit more about this because I think a lot of times in the Connecticut state legislature with these state races, we do see a lot of bipartisanship and bipartisan work sometimes, and a lot of times it's an agreement on the issues, but maybe a disagreement on how to get there or what the exact solution would be. So what do you feel like for your candidates are the ways in which they want to see things change that are currently being done right now by Democratic leadership?
Sure. So, when you just had, the comptroller on, Sean Scanlon, talking about the various guardrails that we have in place that were put in 2017 in the minority budget that was developed by the Republicans, and it was the first minority budget in the history of the United States to be adopted in a state. And those guardrails were put in. We now have Democrats who want to scale back those guardrails and who want to remove those fiscal protections because there's money there. We want to spend it. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that we're going to contend with in the next legislative session is how to deal with those fiscal guardrails. To the governor's credit, he has said, no, we're not going to play with the fiscal guardrails. I like those very much. They've done a lot of good things for the Connecticut budget, and we're not going to scale them back or remove them to allow these monies that are coming in to be spent in ways that may not be in the best interest of the state of Connecticut, but may be more partisan or politically motivated. So I think that's going to be the big issue that is really going to be looked at from a fiscal and a budget perspective is what are we doing with the guardrails? Are we going to keep them? And how are we going to deal with the pension situation that we currently have? We're talking about looking at employee and state employees since Ned Lamont's been governor, have received a 33% pay raise over 6 years when most of Connecticut are still struggling. When we look at the United Way Alice report that 40% of Connecticut households can't pay their bills every month, that's a concern that is going to have to be dealt with. How are we addressing that? And to Luke's point, he's right. The state can't control a lot of what happens because it's a global economy, but there are things the state can do. So when we start imposing mileage tax on trucks that are delivering the food to the stores, that increases cost of groceries. That increases cost of gasoline. That increases cost of other things along those lines. So what are we looking at, and how are we imposing tax structures that are causing prices to increase, that are causing wages to stagnate, that are causing businesses not to create new jobs, which are making it more expensive to build the affordable housing that Luke talks about. So how do you control those things? And I think those are the issues that we're going to have some differences of opinions on and how to deal with.
And Ben, really quickly here, we just have a couple minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit more on a broader scale. This is obviously a presidential election. I mentioned at the top, the state was called for Vice President Harris. We see sometimes with Republican candidates in the state of Connecticut want to distance themselves from former President Donald Trump because he can be a contentious figure. But we know that you've kind of said the party is all in behind him. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and why you're pushing for him tonight?
Sure. I think the reality of the situation is that 4 years of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz will continue to bring the country down financially, will continue to cause hardship for the people in this country on those kitchen table issues that we're talking about. Look, do I think Donald Trump is a guy I want to have dinner with? Probably not. Probably nobody at this table wants to have dinner with Donald Trump, and that's fine. I have no issue with that. But when I look at where we were when Donald Trump was president, and I understand the last year of COVID, and I'm not sure that would have changed regardless of who the president was. It had been Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, or anyone else. That was a lifetime pandemic that we had never seen before. And to Donald Trump's credit during that pandemic, remember Operation Warp Speed, where we developed a vaccine in 6 months that would normally have taken us 10 to 20 years to develop, that was developed within 6 months. So when I look at where we are and where we were and where we want to go, I think the choice is easy. You got Kamala Harris, who's going to continue the Joe Biden failed policies, or we move to a better economic structure.
And Luke, I want to give you a really quick response here.
I appreciate it because there's a lot that I'd like to respond there to. I'm just going to pick and choose a couple things. First, this point about the state guardrails and Democratic leadership. Let's be clear that under Democratic leadership over the past 5-6 years, the state has made more investments than ever before in our pension system, has built up the rainy day funds, delivered the largest tax cut in the state's history. So nobody can say that Connecticut Democratic Party doesn't have a record of strong fiscal discipline. I think the question we're going to face in the coming months is whether we're getting the balance right when it comes to the investments we're making. You know, the guardrails that Ben talked about this year are projected to save or sort of compel the state to save $1.2 billion, $1.2 billion. At the same time, they may force the state to make cuts to current services that end up increasing costs for families, right? If you're cutting things that result in tuition increases, that make it harder to address the child care affordability challenge, the housing challenges, or reductions to education spending, for example, that then Connecticut residents have to make up for in the form of property tax, you're increasing the tax. So I think what we need to do is have a real honest conversation about the balance that we're striking and whether we're getting it right. And I think the Democratic Party has had a really strong record of showing that it is committed to fiscal discipline, and we also have to have a serious conversation about whether we're making the investments that we need to make. On the point about the national stuff and President Trump, you know, I couldn't disagree more. I think that the risk of going back to the chaos of Donald Trump is a risk not just to our politics, but to our economy. And maybe we can talk more about that later.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I didn't want to cut you off because, I mean, as you both know, I love speaking with both of you. We could keep going for the whole rest of the night, but our producers wouldn't be too excited about that. We do want to say, though, as you mentioned, to not go anywhere because we are going to have you back and we are going to be talking more about economic factors, concerns. But first, joining me now in studio, Sarah and Brent, you two are going to be taking over here now for our special coverage at 9. So, you know, what can we expect coming up from you all in the next hour?
You know, Emma, I was just kind of fascinated by the discussion, and if you guys wanted to talk for another 30 minutes, I'd just love to sit here and listen because a lot of people making a lot of good points here. It's good stuff. At any rate, we do have a lot of exclusive analysis here in studio, and thanks for staying with us. I'm Brent Harden.
And I'm Sarah Sanchez. Results are coming down from the race for the White House to Congress and Connecticut State Capitol.
We are starting to get more results in an hour after polls closing. Of course, important to remember tonight, more than a third of the state's registered voters already cast their ballots before Election Day. More than 740,000 taking advantage of in-person early voting, and that's not even counting the absentee ballots.
And we have continuing team coverage at the campaign parties now that the polls have closed. We also have exclusive interviews and analysis here for you tonight. Let's take a look at this map, though, from the Associated Press. The very latest, these are the results from the presidential race right now. Kamala Harris, the current vice president of the United States, has been called as Connecticut voters' presidential winner. Kamala Harris has been called for Illinois also in just the past few minutes, along with Delaware and our nearby neighbors, New Jersey. Trump has taken Florida, no surprise there, his home state right now. Almost every region did shift to the right there in the southeast. The AP has also called Trump for Arkansas.
Again, Kamala Harris being called early for our state, and a real takeaway here is that it's not a surprise at all. No. Important to note, though, it may seem like we've barely gotten through results. The polls have just closed, and how can they call that? Well, the AP does call landslide races at poll closing or shortly after, like we saw with Kamala Harris here just an hour ago, as soon as we see enough numbers and a big enough picture to carefully but accurately make that call. Again, Connecticut's only senator up for re-election. That one seat has been kept by Senator Chris Murphy. Now look here at the results. The AP is able to call it, but we are still getting results in to see the final count either tonight or in the next day. Now, Fox 61's Kay Pattyfoot was there at Duncan Park at the Democrats' party when the race was called. Kay?
Chris Murphy has won the Senate race in Connecticut and will serve for his third term. Now, some of the things that he's been talking about during this campaign trail is he wants to oppose tax cuts for the wealthy, taking on price gouges, and he supports the Restoration Act and Roe v. Wade.
Just shows how strong and what a great leader he's been for the state. I mean, between gun reform and immigration and foreign policy, he continues to show results. He's one of the strongest leaders, I think, in the Senate overall.
I'm so grateful that Chris Murphy is coming back to the Senate. He's a great partner, a visionary leader, and a strong voice for Connecticut.
Chris Murphy has spoken about how divided Washington feels now, and he said if reelected, he hopes to unite it again. In Hartford, Kay Pattyfoot, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
Now, as for Senator Murphy's opponent, we heard from Matthew Corey just a short while ago.
Fox 61's Kayla Cade is in East Hartford with the Corey campaign.
Matthew Corey tells me he ran because he cares about Connecticut and the direction of the country. Corey hosted a watch party in East Hartford where all of his supporters came to watch the election results. He says there are policies coming out of Washington, D.C. that are not working for the economy, and they just want to see a change. And if he was elected, he said he would bring back solutions that are going to help the state and country move forward. Corey says regardless of the results, he gave Connecticut a voice and gave it his best shot.
Coming from somebody that's a blue-collar, small business owner, understanding the economy, understanding how people are really hurting around Connecticut, just know that I was there for you and did the best I could, no matter what the outcome is.
This is Corey's second election against Senator Murphy. He ran against him in 2018 in East Hartford. Kayla Cade, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
All right, Kayla, thank you. Going now to the 5th Congressional District, still a very tight race between George Logan and Jahana Hayes.
Our Matt Karen. We are going to send it over to our Matt Karen, who's been following the campaign with Jahana Hayes' team. We expected this race to be a little bit tighter this early in the night. Matt, what can you tell us?
All right, sorry everybody, it is loud in here. Right now we are at the Courtyard Marriott. This is the watch party for Congresswoman Jahana Hayes. The mood in the room is one of extreme vibrancy and optimism. You can hear the music in the background. The DJ is starting to play. And take a look at the crowd, all watching the news coverage and the votes as they come in here from the Courtyard Marriott. I'm told that the Congresswoman herself is being sequestered upstairs, watching the votes as they come in and what's expected to be a very, very close race here in the 5th District. Jahana Hayes is the incumbent Democrat. She's 51 years old, got elected in 2019, made history as the first black Democrat and black woman to represent Connecticut. The 5th District is the state's most purple district, Democrat control since 2006. It encompasses a lot of the rural communities in Western Connecticut. Back in 2022, Hayes won this seat from George Logan, or actually, retained it by just 2,000 votes, a very slim margin of less than 1%. Hayes is from Waterbury, former National Teacher of the Year. She's a progressive on the Committee for Agriculture and Education. She's married, she's got 4 kids, and she's signed so far 11 bills into law. She would like to continue that work in Congress, asking for another term. And we're going to continue to watch this race, watch the votes as they counted. For now, we're live here in Waterbury. Matt Karen, Fox 61, Connecticut's news station.
All right, thank you, Matt. We apologize for you audio problems there at the end, Matt. Thank you. Fox 61's Bridget Burelow joining us now after talking to George Logan earlier tonight.
So, Bridget, what can you tell us?
Hi, Sarah. I didn't get your question there. Hey, Sarah, I didn't get your question there, but we are outside a Chamberlain Elementary School in New Britain where polls closed just over an hour ago. It looks pretty slow right now, but just 30 minutes ago, there was still a lot of action here. There were lines around the block in this elementary school. Let's look at the video that we shot earlier today to get a better sense of what I'm talking about. Just take a look at all these lines. Again, this was around 8:20, 20 minutes after lines closed. So it really speaks to the enthusiasm and the energy when it comes to this hotly contested district, District 5, where we are in New Britain. Of course, this came down to a nail-biter of a finish last time around in 2022 between George Logan, Jahana Hayes. A rematch here in District 5. Logan lost that one by about 2,000 votes. It was so close. So a lot of people, a lot of his supporters came out today. A lot of Hayes supporters came out today as well. So when I was talking to voters, trying to get a straw poll here, trying to understand the pulse of this district, it was an even split. I asked two people who were very strong Logan supporters, two people very strong Hayes supporters. Take a listen to what they had to say about who they were voting for and why.
I supported him 2 years ago, and he came within 1% of winning. It was a really tight race. But I don't support Jahana Hayes because she's just too much of a party person. She votes with her party 99% of the time. She hasn't done anything about the education problem in Waterbury. She hasn't done anything about the open borders. She hasn't done anything about the inflation. And it's time for a change.
I do like her as a person and for what she stands for, so I did vote for her today. And you never know what's the right decision until later on, so hopefully it was the right choice.
So there you have it. That is what voters are saying about this race, which is still too close to call. Emma's in studio right now tracking the numbers. And Emma, I know we called the senator seat. We've called a number of other local races, but District 5 is just so close again. It goes back to 2022, like deja vu. Are we getting any sense of an outcome tonight?
Well, Bridget, I have pulled up here now on the board. It's not deja vu. We're not in 2022, but I wanted to show you, as you mentioned, just how close this is. 2,004 votes separating these two back in 2022. And we're going to go ahead and see our updated results for 2024 here. Not a lot coming in. Polls just closed a little more than an hour ago. But Jahana Hayes has a slight lead right now, about 1,000 votes. She's at about 56, 57% of the vote. George Logan, this just flipped on me, 52.1% of the vote, 47, showing you quite literally in real time just how close this race is. Joining me back now, Professor Borelli. We were speaking with you earlier in the hour about the importance of balance of power in Congress. This is one of the most watched House races because, as you can see, it really could flip. So, how important is whoever holds that majority in the House?
You can see how important it is because this is a race that the Republicans have invested considerable effort in. George Logan was selected for the Young Guns program, for which he received considerable financing from the National Party, and then also mentorship, and he had to meet certain standards. So this is also pointing to the success of the Republican mentorship program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're speaking off camera about the differences in the Senate and the House for majority. Right now, there's split congressional chambers. We could see that flip tonight. So tell me a little bit about how much that majority matters in the House.
It's tremendous because you start your budget in the House, and if you don't have money, you don't have a program.
Yep.
So how you control the House, how you're able to set up your priorities through the budget, but also through your tax code, right? Through your negotiations with a variety of agencies. The House is the place where a lot of things start, and this is already pointing to a very complicated scenario.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Borelli, thank you again. We're going to be checking in multiple times throughout the night. This is the latest on our races. We'll be standing here and we'll be following the other congressional races as we get more results in. Sarah, Brent.
Thank you, Emma. Taking a look Taking a look now at the 4th District, currently represented by Democrat Jim Himes. He's a member of the Financial Services Committee, but has a ranking seat on the Intelligence Committee. He's attempting to ward off 2 challengers for the District 4 seat that he's held since 2009. Republican Dr. Michael Goldstein, you see there in the middle, and Benjamin Wesley, a mechanical engineer, an independent candidate. And some of these early returns here, it looks like Jim Himes has quite a sizable lead with 58% of the votes so far.
Yeah, meanwhile, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, one of the highest-ranking Democrats on the House Appropriations Committee, has been the 3rd District's representative since 1991. The race tonight between her and Republican challenger Michael Massey. Some may have heard his story, how he first found out about Donald Trump and the Republican Party while in jail, and that's what inspired him to now run as a Republican. His platform mostly focused on the inner city and recidivism, and you can see Congresswoman DeLauro has a fairly commanding lead here early on.
And in the 1st District, residents there have been represented by Democratic Congressman John Larson since 1999. As a member of the Revenue and Social Security Committees, he's perhaps best known for being the leader of the plan President Biden has endorsed to save Social Security from completely drying up. He's being challenged tonight by former Democrat, now Republican, Jim Griffin. If you look here, John Larson at 63% of the vote so far, with only 8% of the precincts reporting.
And then in the 2nd District, we are looking at a familiar matchup tonight. Representative Joe Courtney being challenged by Republican Mike France again in the state's most Republican congressional district. Democrat Courtney, though, has held the seat since 2006 and right now holds about a 4-point lead in the voting, again, early on.
I want to toss it over to the board now. Fox 61 Emma Wolforst is tracking some of those results, the early results, because it is still quite early. What are you looking at, Emma, and what have you noticed so far?
Well, Sarah, I kind of feel like I'm just going to live here at this board for the rest of the night because things are changing so quickly. If you saw my last hit talking about the 5th District, I have pulled up right now the Electoral College map because, of course, everyone is watching the race for the White House. As we told you last hour, Connecticut was called for Kamala Harris. I'm going to go ahead and highlight it right now because I want to bring up what we're seeing in some of those other important swing states. I'm sure you've seen a lot of people talking about the Rust Belt right here. Right now, you can see our dark shaded states are the races that have been called for a particular candidate. The sort of lighter pink or light blue shaded states are the way a state is leaning as we start to see results coming in. I'm going to go ahead and select Michigan and Wisconsin. Even though they're still white right now, we don't have any results. And we'll go ahead and move over to our key states here so I can show you Connecticut big. Excuse me, I have Massachusetts in. This is what happens when you have such tiny states in the Northeast here. We're going to go ahead. Now we have Connecticut selected. Good key states here. As you can see, Kamala Harris was called for Connecticut with only 7% of estimated total votes in. She's already up more than 19,000 votes here. Not really a surprise. Connecticut nowhere close to being a swing state for the presidential race. But as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my drawing feature here. As you can see, we're looking at what's trending in some of those other big states, Michigan, and right now Pennsylvania, our neighbor a little bit southwest, 19 electoral votes, the most of the swing states. So that's why everyone's watching Pennsylvania. It could be obviously a long night as we wait for some more of those results to come in and some more swing states to be officially called. Sarah, Brent.
All right, Emma, thank you. Now, we saw a historic uncommitted vote movement during the presidential primaries earlier this year.
This November, the vote seems to be splintered even more, especially for down-ballot congressional races.
Yeah, the main dividing issue, the worsening and expanding war in Gaza. We talked to Connecticut voters, many of whom said they just couldn't vote for the major parties today.
There was record distrust and frustration from voters about their choice of candidates in 2024. Despite being a historically blue state, Connecticut's largest voting bloc is actually unaffiliated and independent voters. While some, including federal political leaders, have repeated the warning, people must not split the vote, others say they can't fathom bubbling in any of the major party candidates on their ballot.
We morally cannot support people who are committing genocide, and our government and our elected officials, we see them as all actually committing this genocide themselves. They are not anymore enabling it or aiding it or providing. They are providing the money, the intelligence, the troops on the ground. And now our vote is our most important tool that's left in our hands.
So many people are frustrated by the amount of times they've called their representatives and have just been summarily ignored. There is another way for us to get our message across and to force our representatives to listen to us.
To this day, we made more than 23,000 calls to elected officials in Connecticut.
During the April primary, more than 7,600 registered Democrats in Connecticut voted uncommitted for the presidential candidate, about 11% of the turnout. Many didn't feel heard or valued by the major party platforms, like Connecticut's own ceasefire delegate, Issam Boré.
People were screaming at us that's like, this is not your place, get out of here. It's like, really? If the Democratic convention is not my place, so where is?
What was meant to be a primary movement to get the presidential administration and congressional delegations' attention is now continuing for many who say they're ready to cast their votes for more third-party candidates.
Both parties, the Republicans and Democrats alike, have failed this country, have failed to recognize and to accept that the people actually want to see change in all levels, in whether it's domestic or internationally.
Or run outside the major parties, like New Haven resident and write-in candidate Shahad Omar. She once interned with Jahana Hayes' Democratic office, but as a Palestinian, she now feels there have to be more courageous choices and conversations at the Capitol.
I think that a big conversation that I've had mostly was with a lot of Democratic voters who are just like, oh, you're independent, we will not be voting for you. And it's like automatically like a red line as soon as they hear that you're not Democrat or not Republican. People have to give it a chance, because right now with everything that we've been doing, we haven't really seen change. If anything, things in Connecticut have not been getting better.
We want to stop the genocide, but we also want to see our country advancing in all aspects. Instead of trying to improve the American lives, both parties have been engaged in wars outside, pouring now billions of dollars in a genocide. Is not fair anymore to anyone. It's not fair to the American people, who deserve better education system, better healthcare system, better transportation, housing, and infrastructure, you name it. Our country suffers from so many, on so many levels, and instead of using this money to support the American people, you are sending it to a genocide.
All right, for historical context, in the 2020 presidential election, more than 27,000 residents voted for candidates other than Democrat or Republican, nearly 1.5% of the total vote.
That number only grew slightly, still staying under 2% of the vote for congressional races in 2020. We could see greater numbers, though, tonight, especially with the no votes for genocide in Gaza movement.
Now, that's an important discussion here in Connecticut right now, and this could influence Governor Lamont's new commission to look into what's called ranked choice voting here.
Well, let's talk about voter concerns and conversations we're all having tonight with party leaders.
Yeah, Chairman of the Connecticut GOP, Ben Proto, joining us, also former mayor of Hartford, Democratic delegate, and organizer Luke Bronin. So let's start with this question. Campaigns, in fact, do, at least you want them to, reveal voter priorities. So what have you and your teams and organizers taken away from this election cycle and the campaigns? Luke, we'll start with you. Ben, we'll come to you.
Yeah, I think that it's not a surprise. I mean, first of all, I think voters are very focused on the cost of living, and they're also very focused on questions of fundamental rights. I think the issue of women's right to choose has been important and central to this election, as it should be. I think questions about our democracy and and trust in our institutions has been central, as it should be. I think all of those things are at play.
Ben, what do you think are driving voters?
I think I would agree with Luke on the fiscal issues. The economy, inflation, we know is always at the top of the list, and even more so now. We look at nationally, the southern border is clearly a top issue. The fentanyl and opioids coming across the border, and the large number of opioid deaths that we're seeing across this country, particularly with people under the age of 45. And what's happening overseas in Ukraine and in the Middle East, I think have a lot of people very concerned about the state of the world and what America's role is in that to address those issues. So on a national level, those federal issues, I think those are the big issues that people are talking about.
And with so many voters just only a few months ago, right, were very apathetic about their choices when it was Biden and Trump running against each other. They were frustrated with their choices. And this campaign or this election season has been a bit of a roller coaster. We had, Trump was shot at a rally. We had Kamala entering, kind of felt like the 11th hour. So where do you think engagement stands today with this election? And what do you hope comes after this election? I'll start with you, Ben.
I think engagement is going to be, at record numbers this year. I think people are very concerned about a lot of things, and so I'm expecting a large turnout, not only here in Connecticut but across the country. And Connecticut, to our voters' credit, I always say our voters are smarter than our politicians, and they really understand what's going on. And I think they take a lot of time to learn about the issues and the candidates. So I think we're going to see good turnout in Connecticut and across the country. I think going forward on engagement, one of the areas that I think both parties have really lacked in is engaging younger voters. I did a TikTok video 2 weeks ago, which, interestingly enough, most of the news reporters who were in my age group thought it was the dumbest thing they'd ever seen. And I had people under the age of 40 emailing me and calling me going, I love this is great. And so finding new ways to talk to those voters, to younger voters, and understanding that their issues are the same as our issues. We just kind of look at them differently, and I think understanding how to talk with them and engage them in conversations of those issues, of things like we talked about earlier, like affordable housing, like fiscal issues, like transportation issues, like grocery issues. They all have the same things. They're all coming into the workforce. They're making their first paychecks. They're learning very quickly that rents and mortgages are not cheap, and mom and dad's basement isn't always the best place to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Just real quick, just to be clear, in that TikTok video, you didn't eat a Tide Pod or anything.
No, I had a hot dog, a glizzy. I had a glizzy.
You're real hip, yeah. Well, as he mentioned, though, both parties are struggling to kind of get that younger vote, especially when you're so divided. I saw so much divisiveness between the younger generation, especially with the war in Gaza specifically. So how do you think voter engagement is this time around?
Look, first of all, we're going to learn a lot coming out of the next few days that we don't know right now. I was looking earlier this evening at the lines at universities in Pennsylvania where, there were an extraordinary number of young people coming out to vote. I think it's also important to remember that Americans often tune in late. So, you're talking about a few months ago, people weren't engaged. That's not an unfamiliar pattern. I do think there are things we can and need to do to reach people from a communication standpoint, but more important than that, I think what we need to do is show the American people that we can deliver and make a difference. I think the reason that people get disconnected and alienated from politics is not because somebody isn't talking to them on the right platform. It's because they're not seeing the change in their life as a result of what's happening in the government. And I think that there are a bunch of reasons for that. Under President Biden's administration, there was an extraordinary amount done, right? The CHIPS Act was huge for American long-term economic competitiveness. The infrastructure bill, huge for modernizing our infrastructure. They take a long time to play out. Those are going to be playing out over years to come. And I think we'll see the benefits over years to come. On the other hand, you saw the possibility of making tremendous progress on an issue like the border and border security that unfortunately President Trump prioritized politics over progress. He asked Republicans to kill that bill so that there wouldn't be progress in actually solving the problem, and so he could run on the problem. And I think Americans are sick of that. I think we need to make sure that we are demonstrating that our government is able to act in ways that make a difference in people's lives. And I hope no matter what comes out of tonight, that's what our focus collectively is on.
Let's talk about spending for the couple of minutes that we have left here. You've both talked about fiscal issues tonight. What would you say to voters about your party's priorities and policies, fiscally speaking?
Well, first of all, I think that if you're looking at the national level, it was not a foregone conclusion that we would avoid a near Great Depression in the wake of COVID. There were a lot of people forecasting true economic crisis, and we didn't get that. We did get the inflation that came out, as did countries across the world, and then we saw a careful, steady effort to get that inflation under control and bring it down. We now have a ton of work to do, but I think it's really important to start with that first point, that the economic growth that we've seen, the low unemployment that we have, the continued rise of markets during this time was not a foregone conclusion. We can't take that for granted, and I think that the administration deserves a lot of credit for their stewardship of that. I also think that we are focused on making those investments that are about promoting growth and prosperity in the future. And I think infrastructure is one of them. CHIPS and Science Act, again, about American economic competitiveness is another part of that. And I think there's sort of allies we could talk about at the state level too. But I think it's about that. It's about steady, responsible leadership and investment that makes a difference.
All right, let me stop you there. I think you're finishing up, but we got about 1 minute for Ben. Ben?
I think it's figuring out how to promote how to develop programs that are going to help people grow, how to protect their families. What are we leaving our children and our grandchildren, I think, is the biggest question that folks in our generation have. And where are they going? And I think as we look at the fiscal issues that exist right now, I think the Republicans are going to be talking about how do we improve the economy, how do we improve job growth, how do we improve business creation, how do we get more people self-sufficient and off of government programs, and to be more in tune with their own lives and really develop, and Chris Murphy has talked about this, happier people in this country.
Can I add real quick to that? You know, job growth has been strong. What has been harder is the cost pressure. And so that gets to issues like the affordability and availability of housing, the cost and the burden of childcare. And I think the Democratic Party has been more focused on that and offering better answers there. But that's where the focus of the debate post this election ought to be.
Okay. All right. Appreciate your time. Luke Bronin, Ben Proto, thanks to both of you for joining us here. But we're getting a hard wrap, so we got to move on. Can't forget tonight about those state races that have the most direct effect on day-to-day life in your district and in your state.
Yeah, certainly leaders in both parties agree there's very little chance Republicans could seriously challenge the commanding Democratic majorities in the state Senate and House. Democrats currently have control of the state House with 98 of the 151 seats. In the state Senate, Democrats have a 2-to-1 majority with 24 of the chamber's 36 seats.
And the most competitive races are in the state Senate tonight, meaning that Democratic majority could become even more lopsided. In Lower Fairfield County, Democrats are targeting 2 Republican-held seats, the 36th district and the 38th, held by Ryan Fazio and Tony Huang, respectively. The 8th district Senate, though, which spans several Connecticut towns, could flip from Republican to Democrat. And there are a few House districts that could be a big surprise. So stick with us to the very end here. When it comes to vacancies, where we'll have completely new representation no matter what, there are a dozen seats up for grabs in the General Assembly, a single in the Senate, that's District 22, Bridgeport, Trumbull, Monroe, and then 11 House seats.
And here on Connecticut's news station, we're calling results by the Associated Press. So they've compiled election results in every state for more than 170 years. And when we call races and declare winners, then they do, because the results aren't actually certified for up to a month. So unless a candidate concedes tonight, we will only call races not based on network, but based on the AP's official call.
And you can text the word results to the phone number on your screen, 860-527-6161, for a link to our comprehensive results page with all of the races, and our coverage will be sent directly to you. So again, just text the word results to 860-527-6161 to get all of that sent right to your phone.
Checking in with us now is Professor Mara Sutman-Lee from Connecticut College. I hope I got your name there correctly. We certainly appreciate you joining us this evening. Good evening.
My absolute pleasure.
I want to talk to you about election security and whether voters trust the process. We're coming off the heels of not only one of Connecticut's own ballot scandals in Bridgeport, but also the legal challenges of the 2020 presidential election and the denial of the results, which ultimately led to January 6th. But now, U.S. intelligence is reporting several instances of foreign interference. How would you describe Connecticut voter security standards?
I think that here in Connecticut, we have remarkably, for the most part, uneventful elections. For the 8 years that I've lived here, that's what I have largely observed. And at the same time, scandals do happen. Our election system is a system that is incredibly secure here in Connecticut and across the country, but that doesn't mean that it's a perfect election system. And so I think that on the whole, I would describe the operations that I've seen here in Connecticut, especially with the implementation of our new early voting law, as being very efficient, effective, smooth, and secure.
How would you gauge, or how would you describe voter trust tonight and in this election specifically?
I'm wondering if you could just repeat that question. I think there's some other audio that's coming in and I couldn't quite hear
I
you.
apologize. Yes, we're doing a kind of changing of the guards here. So how would you gauge voter trust, Connecticut voter trust tonight, or just
the voter trust here in Connecticut and across the country? Again, I'm so sorry. There's another feed that's coming in. It's definitely not coming in from my end, so I'm not sure that I can quite hear you.
Okay, I apologize. Hopefully they're fixing it on our end. So yes, how would you gauge voter trust tonight, specifically here in Connecticut for the 2024 election? Okay, it seems like we're having a bit of, let's see, it looks like we have a,
I'm
are you
still
able to hear me
here,
now?
But there is a whole other feed that's coming into my Zoom screen, and I'm not sure.
All right,
exactly.
it looks like we're having some audio issues. Let's take a listen to. We're going to check back in with you, but first, let's take a listen to a report on Attorney General William Tong.
Joining me now, Attorney General William Tong. Thank you so much for taking a couple minutes to come chat with us.
Thanks, Emma.
So we know, of course, nobody has a crystal ball. There's no way to really predict what's going to happen in this election. We know what polls say. There's always discussion, but still we know that anything can really happen. And we know at your office, you're directly dealing this when it comes to legal prep. What does that look like ahead of elections?
So first of all, I'm focused on Connecticut. And I know Connecticut is going to be boring. If I have a boring election day, that's a good day. I know the Secretary of the State is ready, the registrars, the town clerks. So I think Connecticut's going to be pretty seamless. I mean, I'll be at the ready. But I think we also know that no matter what happens on November 5th, on November 6th, because of what we saw in 2020, lots going to happen around the country.
Right.
And all heck's going to break loose. And my colleagues and I, mostly Democratic attorneys general, are very concerned about election challenges because of what we saw in 2020. Right. We're concerned about the threat of violence, and we're ready for it.
There's already been discussions, as you just brought up, of potentially not accepting election results. When you say you're ready for it, what does that look like? How does the office prepare?
So we've been in close communication with our colleagues across the country because, again, in 2020, there were challenges all over the country, and they went up to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And unfortunately, we had a standoff with our Republican colleagues in the Supreme Court. Thankfully, the U.S. Supreme Court did the right thing in that moment. They basically dismissed the case and held the union together. And what they said and confirmed is what we all know, which is elections are safe, they have integrity, and they're reliable, and they're accurate in this country. And we want to make sure that that continues to be the case, even if people look on X, on social media. Obviously, the former president is casting doubt on the results, not just of 2020, and he's never accepted those results, but he's casting doubt now in advance in 2024. So we're ready for all of that. But I can't tell you how it's going to hit us, where it's going to hit us, in what state, in what court. I can just tell you that we've seen this movie before, and we're ready.
Right, being proactive.
Yes.
And your office is constantly dealing with the push and pull of state versus federal laws. It's something we've talked about before. We know Connecticut has been in and is in plenty of lawsuits, whether it comes to, healthcare laws, gun control, cannabis, reproductive rights, what have you. The American Map of Policy policies really look so different now depending on what state you're in. We have seen some unprecedented Supreme Court repeals. Residents and lawmakers have told us they are concerned about what could happen on a federal level, even though they might feel safe or feel confident in Connecticut's state laws. They might feel like they might be dismantled by, federal laws with this election and all these fears and questions. What do you tell people, the residents of Connecticut? What should they know about our state laws?
They're right to be concerned.
Yeah.
We have strong state laws, particularly, for example, on reproductive freedom and choice and a woman's right to decide what happens to her own body. And that's enshrined in our law, and it's very strong. But no doubt things are happening in other states like Texas, where the Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton has gone into court to try to get access to medical records and healthcare records of women who are looking to get reproductive health care and maybe get an abortion outside of Texas. That could implicate women and doctors and nurses and healthcare providers here in Connecticut. So we're very concerned about that. I've been to Texas. I've seen what it looks like today, and it's really scary. I've been to a healthcare clinic in Texas that a little more than 2 years ago was bustling and full of people, not just getting access to reproductive health care and abortion, but regular checkups, mammography, gynecological checkups, health care that they couldn't get somewhere else. But now that place is empty. It's closed. It's boarded up. It's shuttered. That's really scary, and nobody should think that just because we have strong laws here in Connecticut that we should be any less vigilant and any less in the fight. I'm very much in that fight in Texas because it impacts people here in Connecticut.
And is that what you would want residents to know, that you, as Connecticut's Attorney General, are in that fight?
We're in all of those fights, on reproductive freedom and choice, in abortion, on immigration, in all of those, in protecting our taxpayers here in Connecticut, and protecting our environment and our clean air and clean water. I'm in every single one of those fights.
No matter who ends up in the White House or in, the federal delegation.
Frankly, we don't always agree with people of the same party. And so sometimes if it impacts Connecticut, no matter what the issue, if it impacts Connecticut adversely, we're going to take action.
Well, Attorney General Tong, thank you so much as always. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was our Emma Wolforce with that exclusive interview with A.G. Tong. Let's take a look at the 2024 electoral map, courtesy of the Associated Press. These are the results from the presidential race right now. Nothing surprising here. We're still waiting on some of those key battleground states out east. In the West, polls haven't closed yet, so we still have a while to go before we see results there. But Kamala Harris, the current Vice President of the United States, has been called as Connecticut voters' presidential winner. No surprise.
And the only other race that's been called here in the state is that of Senator Chris Murphy. Republican challenger was Corey Matthews. That race called already. Chris Murphy the winner. He'll go back for another term in Washington. 39%, maybe not a bad showing for the Republican challenger, considering what a stalwart member of the Connecticut delegation Chris Murphy has been. But as we said, all the other races right now are too close to call at this point. Still, of course, early in the tally. But that's where we stand.
To do.
Yeah, a lot of counting to do. And as we just heard Attorney General William Tong talking about in his conversation with Emma, every election does bring concerns about what federal laws could challenge or change the laws and rights we're used to here in the state.
Yeah, and that push and pull of state and federal laws is constant, especially when we're looking at such different campaigns when it comes to health care, from abortion even to gender affirming care.